Hi there. Today we're going to be looking at the Year 9 history criteria for the Industrial Revolution Research Essay assignment. So the first thing to keep in mind is that there are 4 criteria across which your work will be marked. Each are worth the same amount, so they are all weighted equally, and they are all equally important when calculating your final grade. So the first criteria you'll be marked on is historical knowledge and understanding. So this assesses what information you've provided in your research journal and your essay. This is your content knowledge. The second criteria is questioning and researching, which assesses the questions that you've written for your research and the sources that you've provided in your research journal. The third criteria is your analysing and interpreting criteria, which assesses the evaluation of sources in your research journal. And finally, your communication criteria will assess your essay, references, and bibliography. So those are the 4 types of criteria that you will be marked on. We're going to look at each section of the criteria sheet a little more closely. So firstly, historical knowledge and understanding. You can see there's the same element of the grading across all of these dot points. So for each dot point, what your teacher is looking for is how well you have explained the knowledge that's included in your research and your essay. So for an A, your knowledge has to be explained in a very comprehensive and complete way. For a B, it needs to be in a detailed way, still specific and quite detailed. For a C, you have some explanations in there, but they're not as detailed as they would be for a B. And for a D, you have some descriptions of knowledge within that. So the types of knowledge that your teacher is looking for, you can see there are 4 dot points here that your teacher will be looking for. The first dot point is about patterns of change and continuity over time. So your teacher is looking that for your information that you have talked about things that changed during the Industrial Revolution, things that stayed the same during the Industrial Revolution, and that as part of that you've talked about key events that changed things in the Industrial Revolution, and what certain individuals or groups did that might have changed things or kept things the same. So this could include key people who perhaps invented certain technologies, or groups of people such as children, women, farmers, workers, etc. So that's the first dot point your teacher is looking for. The second dot point in this heading is the motives and actions of people at the time. So in your information, you would need to include the reasons that people were doing certain things and the reasons behind what they did at this time. So as part of the information and the actions of individuals, you'd need to have mentioned the reason why these things were happening. The third dot point is about the significance of events and developments over the short and long term. So as part of the information in your essay, you'd need to have included something about how important these events were. Why were these events so significant? Why were they worth mentioning in your assignment? Did they have a short-term impact, so things that affected the country immediately, or was it something that affected the country in the long term? You then also need to be able to show different interpretations of the past. So that might be different sources about the same topic that you have included in your research and your essay. It might be primary and secondary source interpretations, different people giving a different perspective on what happened. And again, across these 4 dot points, your teacher is looking for whether you have explained these in a way that is comprehensive, detailed, just explained, or a basic description. The second criteria your teacher is looking at is questioning and researching. So the first thing they're looking for there is the development of different kinds of questions to frame a historical inquiry. So this dot point is looking at your focus questions. You should have 3 focus questions in your research journal, and your teacher will be marking you based on whether those are discerning questions that are very detailed and look at a great level of focus and depth for those questions, whether they are informed, whether you have 3 questions that can frame your inquiry, or whether you simply have some questions that relate to the inquiry in some way. The second dot point that your teacher is looking at for this criteria is an interpretation, processing, analysis, and organisation of information from a range of primary and secondary sources, and your use of that information to answer the questions. So what this dot point is looking at is that you firstly have primary and secondary sources throughout your research booklet. You can see for an A, B, and C, you need to have a range of primary and secondary sources, that you have used those sources in order to answer the inquiry questions. So make sure that the information from those sources actually answers the topic that it needs to and answers your questions. And then as part of your research booklet, checking that you have interpreted and understood the source, you've processed it into your quotes and dot points, you've then analysed it using the analysis and evaluation sections in the booklet, and you've filled in that booklet in a way that is well organised. So for an A in this criteria, you have to have a discerning use of the information and have effectively answered the question. For a B, it's an informed use, so it's still quite intelligent and informed, and you have also effectively answered the questions. For a C, you have used the information from your sources, but it might not be as informed as a B. And for a D, you have aspects of the information, and it answers aspects of your question. The third criteria is about analysing and interpreting the information. So the first section is about examination of the sources to compare different points of view. This is in your research booklet where you have filled in the information for each source on perspective, motives, and values. And your teacher will be looking at whether you filled that in a discerning way, so very detailed and to the point, whether it's an informed examination, whether you have simply completed it and it's still accurate but not very informed, or whether you have some use of that aspect. The second dot point here for analysing and interpreting is about evaluating the sources by analysing their origin, purpose, and drawing conclusions about how useful they are. In order to complete this, your teacher will be looking again at perspective in terms of the origin. They will also be looking at motives for the purpose behind the source. They will be looking at your answers for relevance as well, because that is what usefulness is really all about, the usefulness or relevance of the source. For an A in this criteria, you need to have discerning evaluation and justified conclusions about relevance. For a B, you need an informed evaluation and detailed conclusions about relevance or usefulness. For a C, you have simply analysed and drawn some conclusions. And for a D, you have some explanation and some partial conclusions. Finally, in this criterion, you are being graded on developing your own interpretations about the past. So this is where you would be looking at the reliability of the information and how much of the information and which parts you selected in order to help with your research. Your teacher will be looking at whether you have done a discerning interpretation of the reliability in your selection of notes, whether it was an informed interpretation, whether it was an interpretation, or whether you only had aspects included. Finally, your teacher will be marking you on your communicating criteria. This section about the development of texts incorporating historical arguments, you can see for an A, B, C, and D, that is essentially your development of an essay in this situation. As part of marking your essay, your teacher is looking at 4 dot points. The first one is about the organisation and presentation of your conclusion. So that looks at how well organised your essay is, whether you have followed the structure that is outlined on your task sheet, whether you have included the evidence in it the way that you need to, and your teacher is looking at whether you have purposefully organised it the way you have been instructed, and whether you have justified your conclusions with evidence, whether you have done that for a B in an effective way with some informed conclusions, whether you have simply organised your presentation, or whether you have partial organisation of partial conclusions. The second dot point is about your use of relevant historical terms and concepts. So what we are looking at here is the vocabulary that you have used and making sure that it is accurate and specific to the type of terminology that you need for your question. So for an A, it needs to be discerning and relevant use of that historical language. For a B, it will be informed and still relevant. For a C, you have used some of that historical language. And for a D, you've used some historical terms, but maybe not enough concepts. The third criterion or dot point under communicating here is your use of evidence identified in sources. So that's about using quotes and summaries from the evidence you've collected in your research journal. And that's done either at a discerning level for an A, an informed level for a B, you've used some for a C, or you've used aspects of for a D. The final dot point under this communicating criteria is about referencing your sources. So that needs to be done using the conventions as outlined in your student planner. You will need to have in-text referencing through your essay as well as an accurate bibliography. If you have an accurate in-text referencing and bibliography using those conventions in your planner, that is an A. If you have referenced and used appropriate conventions but you did not have a bibliography or you were missing something, that's a B. If you have some referencing of sources, that's a C. And if you've got partial referencing of sources but aspects are missing, that is a D. Make sure you talk to your teacher if you are unclear about any of these aspects or criterion, and best of luck with your assessment.